Hi, and welcome to the context for My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. All images used in this PowerPoint are of the public domain. We're going to be looking at three key points of context. We're going to be looking at the poet himself, Robert Browning. We're going to be looking at the eras he lived in. And we're going to be looking at the Duke, who the poem was based on. Okay, now Robert Browning was an English poet and playwright, similar to Shakespeare, who was considered a master of dramatic monologues, so characters that would talk to the audience. He married another poet who was actually more well known than he was, and their marriage was considered one of the more famous literary marriages. He moved to Italy, which was a place that Browning was fascinated with. He even referred to it as his university, due to everything that he saw and learned there. Now, he was originally Christian, but he did what was referred to as a nonconformist Christian, which meant that he didn't actually follow a lot of the things that were set out by the church. However, spiritualism was something that he actually criticised, and later, after reading a lot of other poets of the time, became atheist. He admired a lot of the Romantic poets, such as Percy Shelley, who wrote Ozymandias, and his own poems had a lot of dark themes that were familiar to the Romantic poet movement. Now, Robert Browning saw 3 different kings and queens reign in Britain during his lifetime. I mean, technically there was 4, but he was only 2 years old when George III died, so there wasn't much influence on his poetry there. First, in his younger years, he saw George IV on the throne, and this was a king who caused a lot of political unrest in his lifetime because he held very open and strong views against the Catholic Church. He was very open, very loud in these views, and that caused a lot of strife in the political world as the kings and queens weren't supposed to have a big public opinion. Then, William IV took the throne after George, and William was actually quite popular, a lot more down to earth than George had been. But he was actually at the head of more political unrest. He was part of a reform crisis, which meant that Parliament was struggling to hold itself together, and the public were actually wanting a complete electoral reform of it. Eventually, the House of Commons rose in power, and despite a lot of violent demonstrations, George remained quite popular until his death. And finally, Browning saw Queen Victoria rise to power and would see her on the throne for a long time up until his death. Queen Victoria had expectations that women shouldn't work and would remain in the household. During her reign, she was a queen that seemed to symbolise moral values of family and home. She's Britain's second longest reigning monarch, staying on the throne until her death. A lot of technological advances were made in her lifetime, and the Victorian age became an age that strove towards industry. The Romantic period of literature was quite dominant in this era. Now, the poets that Browning idolised were writing their most influential poems regarding things that were political, philosophical, and quite intellectual. Okay, Duke Ferrara. Now, he was a real person, so the person speaking, the narrator in My Last Duchess, was actually based on a real person, who was the Duke of Ferrara, Modena and Reggio. He was actually the Duke from 1559 to 1597. He was suspected to have had his first wife poisoned. Incidentally, this was never proven, and he was able to be remarried 2 other times. That's 3 marriages in total. His first wife, Lucrezia, was only married to him for 2 years before she died. He was a man who actually raised Ferrara to its highest point. He was a huge purveyor of science and art. During an earthquake, he made sure to have very important cultural buildings, such as a huge castle known as the Castello Estense, rebuilt in the aftermath. Now note, Browning actually shows this in the way that the Duke in the monologue talks a lot about art. He seems very proud of the things that he's collected. However, he didn't have any children with any of his 3 wives, so the legitimate line of Ferrara ended with him, and it actually ended that era. Okay, so what's left? Try to revise these 3 points. For every quote you look at, try to create a sentence that includes one of the 3 key points of information. And further your research on the 3 topics discussed today. Have a bigger look at Robert Browning, the poet. Now think about more history regarding the Duke and what was going on in Britain at the time this was written. I've already name-dropped people like Percy Shelley, who wrote Ozymandias, and there are videos on this page that also talk about the context at the time they were living in. And it's the same time as Browning, so if there is anything that isn't covered here, have a look at the other videos. It might be included in someone else's context. Now that you know all this, goodbye and good luck.